welcome. So today we're going to be talking about maybe we could call it the real work of spiritual evolution. So not just the light or the breakthroughs, but also the resistance, the vulnerability, and maybe even the moments that we would rather skip over. So it's more about getting at the heart of the things that we avoid and when we say that we're seeking. So the places where we might use beautiful language or powerful tools or even sacred rituals, not necessarily to deepen what it is that we're doing it, but to actually to stay safe or to try and stay separate. So there was a time in my life, I could probably say that there was more than one, right? Where on the surface, I was practicing and I was studying and I was teaching. But really, when I looked at it in a retrospective, I was avoiding. So I was avoiding many different things. I was avoiding aspects of myself. I was avoiding different aspects of relationship. I was avoiding different aspects of being seen. And I was even avoiding the deeper call that was asking me into much more. And even though I was feeling at the time that I was doing as much as I possibly could, that I was standing in the greatest place that I could in terms of my own spiritual development, as I look back, there were some key factors that were in the mix that were telling me that that actually wasn't what it was that was happening. And one of the things that came out of this is I started to think, well, if this could happen to me, right, then this could happen to anybody because I considered myself someone who is very diligent about this particular piece of the path. That I had a high level of commitment, high level of integrity, high level of focus. And I thought that I was really watching what it was that I was doing and in attending to things in a way that was of the highest and best. So it's interesting how it was interesting to me, or I learned how sometimes our spiritual practices, or not even sometimes, but often, they become a hiding place, even when we're doing so many different things to try and prevent that. So I wanted to open up a little bit of dialogue here today about this topic, and not really so much from a place of like shame or blame or we should have done better or anything like that, but more from a place of curiosity, of compassion, just wanting to see clearly and wanting to understand more about what are the kind of things that truly get in our way. So it's a little bit about the shadow side of spiritual progress. You know, the way that we sometimes bypass the real and in the name of awakening. And the word that is often used here is spiritual bypass, spiritual bypassing. So they're practices or ways of being that look like evolution, but they're actually evasion. So it sounds like wisdom, but it actually covers our fear. It sounds like the right answer, or it looks like the right answer, but it somehow, it's just slightly missing the point. And this is so much of what makes the path tricky. And when we get called to deepen into our spiritual understanding, our spiritual study, but our ego is so clever. And it can take basically any tool and turn it into something that is a snare or as a challenge for us. So I had a spiritual teacher once say to me that as soon as you've spotted your ego, it's gotten smarter. I love that. I use that so often. It's so helpful. As soon as you've seen your ego, it's gotten smarter. And this just speaks to exactly what I was saying, how easy it is for us to really, in our greatest, with our greatest intentions, want to stand in a good way, and how easy it is for us to get confused in that process, because the path takes a huge amount of discernment, and we're gonna get into that a little bit more here as we move forward. I want to stop first and share a little bit about what I was mentioning before about my own personal journey with this. So not so very long ago at all, and while I was living in California, I was deeply engaged in spiritual study. So I would say that, I mean, really, my entire time was engaged in spiritual study, which in a way is normal for me because it is integrated into my whole life. But this was a little bit different in that there was actually, what it was showing was that there were these spaces, there were these ways that I had disconnected from life. And so what came out of that piece, and I'm going to start going to some details more, what came out of that piece is really that when our spirituality takes us away from our life, I'm not talking about for a moment or for a practice or something like that. I'm just talking about pervasively and in an ongoing way. When it stops us from deepening our relationship with anything, then perhaps we're missing the point a little bit. So at this particular point in time, like I said, I was very, very focused on what it was I was doing because I loved it so much. I cared about it so much. I was practicing regularly. And that practice was like all consuming. Basically, it took, I was reading, I was writing, I was holding ritual space for people on an ongoing and regular basis. And I did very little besides that. I actually started to see changes in my habits, such as like I was having a difficult time eating well, exercise. I wasn't engaged in any outside activities. I couldn't see actually, like there wasn't time or space in me for any kind of activity outside of what it was that I was doing. And again, I didn't really have a problem with this inside myself. If you'd asked me, I would just say I was very focused at the time. And what happened is during this period of time, I actually, and through my research, I actually came across some other work, a different type of work. And I started to explore it a little bit. And as I started to explore this work, at first, what I noticed was that there was a deep resistance to a number of different things. And I think that these are also key points as well. So one key point is that somehow it's bringing us out of life instead of into life. It's decreasing the way that we are in our lives, living our lives in totality. And also that we wind up having a very strong resistance. And that's different than discernment, and that's different than choice. But we wind up having a very strong resistance to what challenges this, what it is that we're connected to. So the importance of that is because if we're truly in a good place and we're really clear, we might protect or guard what it is that we're truly clear about, our practice, it's important to us and things like that. But we actually don't need to resist or fight against just other ways of doing things. They might not be for us. We might choose not to engage with them. But when they come our way, or when they come our way, or when we stumble across them, I guess, then when we have a resistance to that, or resistance to what someone is proposing, then that speaks to something else that is going on. Why? Because really, when somebody proposes a spiritual direction or practice, and it's not for us, that's pretty much all that happens, right? I'm not really interested in that. Right? Like, think about the difference between like a piece of cake, and you just don't want it, or a piece of cake that you're saying no to because you're on a diet, or a piece of cake that gets offered to you when you think that sugar is bad and ruining humanity, right? All of those experiences are going to be slightly different. And in that different experience, it kind of shows us some of what's going on with us, right? And so we want to notice that in these situations. We notice them when we resist, or we need to find a way that something is wrong rather than not for us. And I'm not talking about areas of obvious problems, something that is like truly destructive. I'm not talking about that category of things right now. It's for another day. But right now, just saying that when we see that resistance in ourselves, what it can do is it can say, oh, right, there's something I'm not so sure about on the inside. That's a very helpful thing to see, right? Because if I was sure about it, I wouldn't be having this kind of process. I would just be making a choice. That's not for me. So then when we start to engage in something, but we fight it, which I also experienced during this process, then when you start to engage in something, you fight it, then you really have to ask what's going on, right? Because it's just like, okay, so I'm saying yes to this, but I'm saying no to this at the same time. What is it? What is happening here? And one of the reasons that we do that is because we know that the real spiritual call asks us to give up things. We inevitably are going to need to give up something along the way in order to grow into what it is that we're going to become, in order to proceed on the path. So we have to give things up. This is sometimes talked about in terms of sacrifice. And it's not really something that is negative. It's not like, oh, you must suffer in order to develop spiritually. It's not that teaching at all. What it is, or that idea at all, it is the teaching that in order to become more, we sometimes need to let go of what's holding us in, what is making us, holding us where we are now. So when we resist that process, when we resist something that comes our way, we're past the point if that's not for me or whatever, but it's in there. And instead of being able to just process it and see what's here for me, right? But we fight against it. A lot of times here, people will start to like demonize or make something wrong. They'll start to say, oh, that's really bad because, or that's not for me because. And those are all really just their resistances to keep themselves in the comfortable place. Because if we're really truly, what happens when you align with a spiritual path and you feel strong on it is just that. You feel strong on it. You feel grounded on it. I'm not saying there aren't difficulties, because there are for sure difficulties. But actually, one of the keys that we're headed in the right direction is that we feel a growing sense of strength inside of us and a growing sense of clarity in each thing that we encounter. And so we don't, from this place, need to resist. I can talk about this from another way, because many of us do resist even when we're on the right path. But what I'm talking about right now is spiritual bypassing. So we resist and we come up with really great reasons why. It's our spiritual practices are the best. It is something about our calling. It's something about the way that the gods have spoken to us. Something along those lines is the reason why. or we might put down a certain way of being or teaching or something like that in order to feel like my way is like better, my way is more advanced. So that resistance. So we have the piece where it is we are in resistance, and we have the piece where we're disconnecting, which I talked a little bit about in the podcast on relationships. And so these are two big indicators. The other thing is that we stop letting outside teachers in. And I want to clarify what an outside teacher is. So an outside teacher is actually someone who challenges us. Okay? I'm not saying they don't support us and they don't inform us. They do. They inform us, they support us, they help us grow, they see our true nature, all of that kind of stuff. But another thing that they do is they challenge us. Why do they challenge us? So they challenge us because we need someone to help us see where our blind spots are. We can't do it on our own. So if your spiritual teacher, or where you're going for teaching, if at all, is not actually providing you with significant challenge, then you are not actually also getting significant teaching. So many people who are in a bypassing phase start to criticize, you could say, or eliminate the forces, the teaching forces in their life. They go for teaching forces that tell them that they're doing everything right. They go for teaching forces that tell them that what they want to hear, that confirm their progress in a way that's comfortable for them. And they remove any teacher that actually starts to challenge them in that place, like in the place where they don't want to be challenged. And so that's kind of the third piece of the equation, or third major piece of what we can see when we start to bypass in this way. Unfortunately, we're usually not able to see it once we're in there, because there is all sorts of things that are calling us into illusion and delusion and off the path. And many times they can look like the path. So we're overall, the teachings, anything that comes through in this way, any teaching that comes through, any alignment with a path, ultimately, when we sink down inside, we should be able to feel a deeper sense of resonance and health coming through. And if you can feel into that a little bit, my easiest way of describing it for myself is that my head might be saying something, and my emotions might be reacting to something, but deep inside, I can know it's truth. And so I steer by that. I like, no matter what happens in the other realms, and I can get caught in them, well, no matter what happens in those realms, I listen way down deep to this place that I know is trying its best to align with truth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that overall process in just a minute. But that's part of how we keep ourselves on track. And that's part of how we know whether the teachings are helping to keep us on track. Not so much are they producing really great states. Are we seeing an improvement of our ability to do a particular a type of practice? Like, are we more flexible with doing yoga? Or, are we more able to act as a channel or something like that? Not so much those things, but really, is it getting down to what is deeper? The deeper pieces, that deeper level of truth. Is it helping us to move more towards that, and therefore creating a sense of resiliency and strength? And so I found myself in this situation after investing a huge amount of time and energy and love, and so much love, I found myself actually uh, representing all of these things. And I can be a little bit challenging sometimes in terms of, my buy-in to certain practices or teachers or whatever. So that given its own space, I found myself doing all of these things in a way that was starting to actually degrade my connection overall. But I persisted because of my belief that I was headed in the right direction. And because of so much that had happened to build me to that point in time. And really the point that I was missing is not necessarily that I was off track when I started, but just simply that I got off track at a certain point in time. And it is usually a number of different things. It's a number of small choices that happen that lead to an overall large distortion. Because usually in these places, it's not so much like somebody bangs in the door and says, okay, and now I'm going to screw up everything and throw you off your spiritual path, right? That's not usually the way that these events happen. Because if they happen that way, we'd be like, whoa, wait a second, I really care about what it is that I'm doing. But instead, what happens is that it happens just little bit by little bit, and sometimes outside of even our awareness. And we learn, we grow in our ability to see this over time. And that's part of training, that's part of having a teacher, that's part of walking a path that is actually a path and something that you can follow. So this is some of the zone of how we get a little lost in this process. And what is it that actually breaks us through this? And this is where I would say there are a number of different things that break us through. One of the main things is really about growing our ability to listen, to discern, to start to be able to notice when those features that I was talking about are at play, when we're losing sight of that deeper connection to ourselves. But there are other factors that also play a role in this. And one I was talking about before, which is the role of teachers. And the true teacher is going to hold up a mirror to our blind spots. They're going to hold us lovingly accountable. They're going to make sure that we don't hide behind our personality and that we step more and more in, where it's not about inflating someone, or their sense of power or their sense of spirituality, or coddling them or their wounds. It's helping them see what they've been unwilling to face. And that allows us to really be able to grow. So it is that outside influence often that we get to help oversee our process. And it's really important who we're choosing for that job. Because a person can't really help us or lead us very much in an area where they have a lot of blindness themselves. So we need to look to the people who have made it further down the path. And we can look to the results that that path also has. That's another really important feature. Because if we see that when we look down a path, this is what happened to me. This is one of the factors. I started looking down the path that I was on, and I was like, okay, the people who have been doing this longer than me, they're not looking so good. It is really like, if I follow in their footsteps, where I am going is not going to be good for me. And so you want to look down the path and you want to say, yes, at least that person is going in a direction that I truly want for myself. And hopefully has reached a level of attainment that I can follow in their footsteps. They know something, and they can help to clear a pathway for me. So they're not only able to work with you in that way, that's one set of skills, but they've also walked the walk, and they're able to help to clear that path or help to show you the path so that you can move forward. This can, when I look at where most people get off track in terms of their spiritual development, it's because they either don't have the right spiritual teachers or because they don't have them at all. And very often it's because they don't have them at all. It's a very, very important thing. So it's one of the things that we look at. Now, one of the things that a teacher should help you do, and the teachings themselves, is that they should help you grow that sense of trust inside of yourself, that sense of knowing, the connection to truth, a sense of light, whatever it is, however you know that inside of yourself. It should be outlined, what that is, how you know it. Hang on just one second. It should be outlined what it is and how you know it. And it should also be continually clarified. So what you're doing, once you have identified that, if you haven't identified it already, your initial step needs to be able to identify that inside of yourself, and then to help to clarify it and develop it so that you can walk through on your spiritual path without getting thrown off by everything that comes your way. I'm not saying that there won't be challenges. I'm saying that with that, you have an ability to get back on track. And so if you're not consciously aware of what that is, it's important to become more conscious of it. One of the things that helps with this process is initiation. So through initiation, and there are lots of different types of initiation, right? So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But through initiation, we are given energetic support and ability to connect with what I was talking about much more clearly. So we're able to actually get to a different place of connection inside of ourselves and to maintain that better. That's the purpose of the way that initiation is held. Is like there's a lot of different, you could be initiated in lots of different ways, but let's talk in high spiritual teachings, right? So if you're going to be initiated into high spiritual teachings, it's going to help you be able to more clearly identify that inside of yourself and give you the energetic holding to keep making that possible, both the clarity and the holding. So there's a number of other ways that initiation supports, but we're just talking about it in relationship to this staying on the path and not getting caught in spiritual bypassing. So the other thing that initiation does in this sense, again, as I'm talking about it, puts us on a path so that we are actually working and moving along a path that we can then step by step negotiate, and other people have walked it before us. This is a very important thing. This helps us deal with many of the different things that come up. Because if you think about it, it's like, think about having a map or no map. And a map of where you are or no map of where you are, right? That you can wander and you can find your way, and you may or may not get to your destination, or you can actually be able to see a little bit about where you're going. Now, is it the same as where you're going? It's not. Does it have everything included in it that we'll have where you're going? Nope. It doesn't work that way, but it gives you an idea. And so because you're on a path, you have that map. You have that basic idea of where you're going. And so it's easier to see when you get off track. So in clarifying that, just around initiation, before I go to some questions and a couple more pieces of information, but around initiation, there's a lot of things. A lot of people talk about offering initiations, and there's people will talk about self-initiation and various different initiations associated with different practices and all of that kind of stuff. So each initiation is held within the context of its practices. And so each initiation has its own kind of function and benefit or lack thereof. There is, because it is as good as its tools. It's as good as the way that it's been developed, and it's as good as the way that it's being held and cared for. So initiation differs over time or across practices. And so it is important to know that, because you want to know where you are, like what map you're actually using. If you don't know what map you're using and you're trying to apply it to an entirely different area, it's a map of a mountain and you're in the city, then it will not help so much. You won't, and sometimes people think that because they have a map of the mountain, that it is good everywhere. And that's not necessarily true. If somebody says, you've been initiated into this local church, the map is of the wisdom of the local church. That would be like a way to say it. So you want to kind of know how comprehensive or local your map is, so that you start to understand how to work with it. And they might work cross-reference, but they don't necessarily. So these are two things that help. All of these should help you grow your discernment overall. And that helps with those three pieces that I was talking about, are seeing the breakdown in our relationships with what is around us, our resistance to kind of new information, and our relationship or lack thereof to teachers. Those things can be helped, and we can stay on the path by understanding what a path is, by getting initiation to support us and getting that map, is one way to say it, and by having teachers who help support us in that process. So when we can reflect on this overall in our life, we can think about, okay, like, do I have these things? Do I have teachers that can guide and challenge me, right? Do I take in enough information, to check and to learn and to know that I'm standing in the way that I want to? Am I aware when I'm resisting or fighting against something because I'm not willing to take it in? Or have I started to use my practices as a defense, so that I'm no longer engaging with aspects of life in a way that is truly life affirming and supportive and helps me grow as a spiritual being? So it's not so much whether we've done this or not, right? It's really just recognizing what it is and the willingness to move into a different place around it. I'm going to move into a few questions here. You're always welcome to ask questions. Let's see. Okay. What does real growth feel like to you? How do you distinguish it from performative or surface level growth? So this is a very good question. I talked about it a little bit, and because we want to know what this is. It's one of the foundational pieces that helps us progress on the spiritual path, is being able to feel into ourselves and really know when we're on the right track. And this is exceptionally hard to do. It really is. I mean, it sounds like it wouldn't be hard to do, but it actually takes a lot of study and practice and stripping away of things to really know what that feels like. But there's different aspects of it. So I track with various different sensory cues. So I anchor or recognize the sensory cues that are associated with a particular thing, like growth, like being connected to the light, like, so when I feel that, or when I sense into something, a book, a teacher, a way of doing something, right? I look for those sensory cues inside of myself. So I've one in my chest and one in my head that are the most dominant ones. And so the one in my head is light. It's like it looks like light. And the one in my chest is expansion. Those two things are what I go to to know whether I'm on track. And I do the same thing with like when I'm looking at my behavior, like if I'm performing or I'm kind of on the surface with things, right? So I look at that, and one of the things that has grown in me over time is I actually get a bit of a sense of boredom or dullness around things that are performative or surface level, right? But where I can be tricked, like I was talking about before, is when something is stimulating to me, but actually isn't producing growth. And so that's a place where we can get stuck sometimes. We can think because things are particularly good, or things are particularly difficult, or they're particularly strong in volume, or whatever, that those are the things that means that there's growth happening. And we've kind of been taught that, like catharsis, right? Through catharsis. Catharsis means that something's really happening. And yes, right, there's truth there. But when I was explaining how I can get caught in that, and it's not necessarily real growth, because it's the replication of an emotion or a state that is not really about the growth. Growth means that you move beyond it, right? So if there's replication of something happening, we haven't actually grown. We haven't moved beyond something. So we need to check, how is that happening? Is that happening in my emotions? Is that happening in my thoughts? Why is it that I'm replicating that again and again? But when we start to notice that, right, then it's just like, oh, okay, that's not really growth. I feel like I'm having catharsis. I feel like I'm having a new idea, an epiphany, a greater understanding, whatever it is. I feel like I'm getting into a more expanded state in my meditation. I feel like I'm able to contact the higher worlds more, whatever it is. But when we look at it, there's actually not change happening. And it's amazing how easy it is to fool ourselves here. So I use those two cues to really help me. And then also that outside monitor of, have things actually shifted? And that helps me kind of understand whether or not I'm really growing or not. All right, another question. Okay, so when has a teacher or a guide challenged you in a way that felt hard but ultimately helped you grow? Well, going back to a little bit of what I was talking about before. So as I was going through this process, I actually reached out and asked for some feedback from a teacher. And I said, kind of, this is what's going on with me, and this is what I've been doing, and all of that kind of stuff. And I felt like I was speaking in a way that was like grounded and empowered, and somebody who was spiritually knowledgeable. And the response that I got back was actually did not reflect that back to me. What it reflected back was a little bit of I see you. There was a little bit of that, because there was actually a response there. So there was a little bit of I see you, and a little bit of acknowledgement in the process. But there were some very difficult things that were said, and they were said about things that I cared very much and that I had identified with very much. And I worked with this particular piece of information for about a year and a half, if not 2 years, but at least a year and a half. Basically, what I did is I rejected everything, but I knew better than to like really truly reject it. So I got frustrated about it and angry, and I fought against it in my mind. And then I felt that feeling, I felt that feeling in my heart. I had this sense in my mind of like, I could see that light. And even though I couldn't accept what was in front of me, and I worked at it. I would pick it up and put it down, and pick it up and put it down, and argue inside of my head and outside sometimes. It was very, very big teaching, and I had a really difficult time fully processing it. But the more that I stayed with it and didn't try to make anything right or wrong, and was willing to learn from it and just see what was there, be curious and see what was there. And those are some of the skills that I think are helpful. You don't need to make it right or wrong. Be curious to see what's there, be willing to learn from it. And I trusted enough in that process that I was willing to stay there with the information. And ultimately, I saw what was the truth in that information. And it helped me considerably. Now, in the meantime, this being a spiritual teacher and guide, one of the things that you experience or that you need to get used to is that people need to go through their own growth process. And that can be very, very challenging when they are going through something like that example. And that's just one example, but they're going through something like that example where they have to work through something. And so it's important that the teaching is delivered in as clear a way as possible, because that's what helps guide someone through, because they can go back. If something's clear and pure, then the person can find their way to what is the truth there and eliminate anything that is in their way. So that's a responsibility that a teacher has. And it's one of the reasons that I've started to work inside of lineage teachings, because of the level of purity with which they're held, which allows for students to gain a deeper level of understanding and growth, because that clarity is there to be found. It's easier for the clarity to be found, but we're not used to that so much. We're not used to that kind of thing. So we can be very skeptical and very negating of what it is that we're hearing, because we're kind of like, oh yeah, well, everything's true from a certain perspective, and who knows what that person's just a person, and these things. And there's like some truth in all of it, but there is that purity really, really helps us. So as we grow in our own spiritual work, we ultimately, in our own ways, whatever those are, become teachers. We can't help but that's the evolution of the spiritual work, is to give back in some way, to be of service. And we can put label on that, be a teacher in some way through our actions, through the way that we are. So we have that responsibility to stand in a place of purity and clarity to help others. And so there have also been times where I've felt challenged, where I wasn't able to find wisdom in what it was that happened, or not enough anyway. I'm always able to find something. So let's see here, one more. Okay. What would it mean for you to return to the path with a beginner's mind? I like this question. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I do want to talk about beginner's mind a little bit because I think it's really a helpful concept. So we a lot of times deal with paradoxes as we're starting to grow. And one of them is that we need to own our wisdom, right? And hold it with purity and stuff like that. And the other is to be able to be in a beginner's mind. And so this creates a little bit of a challenge as we grow. There can be some awkwardness around it. But to have a beginner's mind is actually what a lot of what I do is aimed at, which is getting us to the place that we can listen to some of that foundational information, those foundational cues inside of ourselves, that we can be open to what it is that's coming our way, and that we can be willing to work with it so that we can truly grow in greater discernment. A lot of people who are spiritually bypassing, you could say, or who have developed themselves with a lot of spiritual identity, don't have the capacity to really grow anymore because they think that they know. And this is another place where people really get stuck. So we want to know what we know. This is the kind of the paradox. It's important to know what we know and to own that. But that once that starts to become the reason to reject or reject or react or belittle or whatever it is, once it becomes that kind of an energy, where we're negating something rather than evaluating it and deciding whether or how true it is. So that actually is a beautiful piece of information right there. So what's the difference between rejecting and evaluating it and making a choice? Because on the outside, they could actually look the same. On the outside, someone who is very discerning might look like they're actually rejecting information quickly because they're able to look at it, absorb it, and then make a choice. The other person could react quickly to a new piece of information, and then they actually, when they react to that piece of information, they wouldn't be able to they don't take it in. They don't actually process what it is that what has come towards them. And like I said, those two things can look very different on the outside. So the beginner mind actually sets the stage to ultimately be able to do the one where you can absorb what it is that's said, but be discerning. And when you're discerning, then you may have a quick choice or not a quick choice in that moment, but you will have an openness. You will have learned from the information. You will have completed with that information, and you'll know which direction you want to go in. So your beginner's mind doesn't mean that you're holding just like everything's good and it's all let in any idea or anything like that. That's not really so much. It's an openness and a willingness to learn from what it is that is around you. And you still, of course, might use discernment to help to develop or to make your decision, to make your choice. And so that's a very important piece of like clarity from the outside, because very often people who who make quick decisions but are actually taking in the information can be seen as rejecting that information. So how do we know? We don't actually know, aside from a feeling of another person. We don't know whether they are just simply rejecting the information or whether they've taken it in. Might be able to feel or sense that on an energetic level, but there aren't a lot of cues that are external. But inside of ourselves, we can just feel whether or not we've allowed ourselves to receive the information before making up our mind about it, or whether we've rejected the information outright. When we get into a pattern of rejecting information outright, regardless of what the reason for it is, we've learned better, we know better, we're spiritually superior, whatever that is, now we kind of fall back into one of those patterns, that bypassing type pattern, where we can't be informed by our environment really in a way. So we start using what it is that we know to become separate from, rather than in relationship to, but discerning. Okay. That last piece is a really good piece. If you have any more questions about that, feel free to send me those questions, because it's a good piece of information. I might go into it more in another podcast. So overall, just as a reminder, as I was saying before, it's not a problem if you found that you have kind of skirted around the real work at some point in time. Part of our work is seeing that and, being courageous enough to call ourselves forward into a new and more authentic and clearer relationship with spirituality. And it's part of the process. We are inevitably in our spiritual development going to be thrown off course a little bit by ourselves most of the time. And it's working with it. And remember, learning how, using the tools that I spoke about to be able to get back on the path. So I want to thank you for joining today, and have a good rest of your evening.